Why do allergies happen and why do antihistamines stop them? So, have you ever wondered why some people start sneezing when they smell pollen or play with a cat or eat certain foods? Why does the nose suddenly become runny? Why do the eyes become itchy and watery? So, today we will uncover the hidden molecule responsible for many allergy symptoms, and that molecule is histamine. We'll also understand how antihistamines work and why they provide relief. So, in today's session, we are going to discuss how allergies happen. What is it? Is it a mystery particle? So they are called allergens. How does the system react to it? The system secret, and what are mast cells, IgE antibodies, and why are the different symptoms appearing? Allergic symptoms, I would say, like sneezing, runny nose, itchy eyes, and the skin rash. And how do antihistamines protect us from all of these symptoms? How do they work? Blocking receptors. How do that? Preventing effects and reducing the symptoms and make us happy and healthy. So now let's start and see a real world example. Imagine you walk into a garden full of flowers. So most people enjoy the smell, but for some with allergies, the immune system overreacts. So the eyes become red, the nose starts running, and there is redness in the nose, and sneezing begins. So the interesting thing is that pollen itself isn't dangerous. The problem is body's response to. When an allergic person encounters pollen, dust mites, pet dander, or another allergen, the immune system identifies it as a threat. So special antibodies called IgE antibodies attach themselves to the mast cells. So the mast cells act like a tiny storage warehouse filled with chemical substances. When the allergen arrives, these mast cells burst open and release histamine. So this is what is happening inside the body. So the allergen is coming in, it attaches itself to the IgE antibodies. There is a chemical and signaling pathway that happens within the mast cell. So this is the mast cell. The mast cell has secretory granules, and because the activation of these secretory granules within the mast cell based upon this allergen that came in and attached itself to the IgE antibody, histamine gets released. So this is the histamine which gets released. Okay, before understanding histamine, we need to understand a special term called autocoids. So many people have heard of hormones, but hormones travel through the bloodstream and affect distant organs. For example, we have insulin, thyroxine, growth hormone, but histamines behave differently. It is released locally and acts near the site where it is released. So that is why histamine is called an autocoid. So on the screen right now you can see there is this comparison between the hormones and autocoids. So as I told earlier, so hormones basically are released from the endocrine glands, which is released in the blood. It is transported via the blood to the distant organs and tissues, and generally it is slower in onset. The hormones take some time for showing their action. It is longer in duration. Low concentration is effective, and certain examples of hormones is insulin, thyroxine, adrenaline, and growth hormone. While for autocoids, the site of production is the various cells in the body is released locally. It's released locally, and it acts basically locally near the site of the release, and it's nearby the cells and the tissues. The action is rapid in onset, quick duration, high concentration is required. Examples are histamine, serotonin, prostaglandins, and leukotrienes. So the difference between hormones and autocoids is that autocoids are basically locally acting and hormones act at a distant site. So histamine is produced and stored in the mast cells and basophil cells present in many tissues. When needed, it is released locally at the site of injury, infection, and allergy. It acts in the nearby blood vessels, nerves, and cells, and it is not secreted by endocrine glands, nor does it travel through a bloodstream to act to a distant organ. So it again restates that autocoids are released locally and acts locally. So in simple words, we can say that hormones are messengers that travel far, whereas autocoids are local messengers. Okay, so the slide deck that you are currently seeing on your screen is one of the most important slides, which will tell us how histamine works on the different receptors in our body. So we are basically having different receptors. So in our body at a different location. So histamine interacts with those receptors in a different way. So while explaining this slide deck, I would want you to imagine like histamine as a messenger molecule that travels throughout your body. But histamine itself doesn't cause any effect until it binds to a specific receptor. Now these receptors, now you can think of these receptors as different locks, and histamine is the key. Now depending upon which lock it opens, your body responds in a different way. So now we are going to explore the different types of the receptors histamine has in the body. So we have receptor which is H1, there's a H1 receptor, we have H2 receptor, H3 and H4 receptor. So now we are having these four kind of receptors. We have H1, H2, H3, H4. So now first of all we are going to discuss about the H1 receptor. So this is a receptor most people are familiar with because it's responsible for the classic symptoms of allergy. When a pollen, dust mites, pet dander trigger an allergic reaction, mast cells release histamine. So histamine then binds to H1 receptors located in the nose, eyes, skin and airways. So once histamine is released and it attaches itself to these to H1 receptors, which is located in different parts of your body, so it will cause a different kind of a body response. So you can have in the nose when H1 is interacted with by histamine, so we have nose sneezing, we have skin irritation, we can feel our eyes get itchy and watery, hives on the body, on the skin, we see that, and we can also experience as bronchoconstriction. So now so this is the reason that we have these kind of symptoms, because histamine has basically interacted with the H1 receptor which is already located at these areas, and to counter this we have certain medications which are called as antihistamines. So this is exactly where the common antihistamine medicines work. So instead of stopping histamine from being released, they block the H1 receptors, preventing histamine from activating it and causing an allergic reaction. So what they do is that antihistamines will come and block the H1 receptor before histamine can come and activate the H1 receptor. So they will come, the antihistamines will, the molecules will come, they will block H1 receptor, and they won't give that space for histamine to come and bind to those H1 receptors, due to which the different kind of reactions that we see in our body, like sneezing, skin irritation, hives, bronchoconstriction, that won't happen. That's the way antihistamines work. So I'll be explaining this in much more detail in the upcoming slides, but this is just a brief overview over here, like how antihistamines basically work. Now this was about H1 receptors in our body. Now we will be discussing in a little bit more detail the H2 receptors. So unlike the H1 receptors, the H2 receptors are found mainly in the stomach. So the H2 receptors are basically in the stomach, and when histamine binds to these receptors, it stimulates specialized cells which produce gastric acid. This helps in digestion of food. So we know that these receptors, H2 receptors, are present in the stomach. So when histamine binds to these receptors, H2 receptors, it releases to the release of gastric acid, which helps us in further digestion of the digestion process. So however, excessive activation can lead to a condition called acid reflux or gastric ulcers. So that's one downside we have, and there are certain medications also which help us in reducing the effect of blocking this effect. So we call this H2 medications, H2 blocker medications. So these medications basically go and bind to the H2 receptors in the stomach, which prevent the further release of more gastric acid that might cause heartburn or acid reflux or stomach ulcers. So we have H2 blocker medications for these. Now moving on to the next type of receptor is the H3 receptors. So the H3 receptors are located primarily in the brain and the nervous system. Their job is quite different. Instead of producing an allergic response, allergic symptoms or stomach acid, they regulate in the release of histamine and several other neurotransmitters. So we know that H3 is in the brain, so they help us in release of regulating of histamine release. Because of this, H3 receptors play important role in sleep, wakefulness, attention, learning, memory and overall brain functions, and it's still under investigation by scientists working actively in studying drugs that can affect H3 receptors. The next type of receptors that we have is the H4 receptors. So the H4 receptors are found mainly on the immune cells, including the eosinophil, mast cells, T cells. These cells help guide immune cells to sites of inflammation, and they also further contribute to allergy and inflammatory responses. Although H4 receptors are not yet targeted by routine allergy medications, they present an exciting area of research. Future drugs that block H4 receptors may offer new treatment for asthma and other chronic inflammatory diseases. So, how histamine causes an allergic symptom? So, as of now, we know that a pollen comes in, the mast cells interact with the pollen, and the mast cells release histamine. Now, histamine is basically an autocoid. So, histamine is getting released locally. So, from the local cells where the pollen interacted with the mast cells, so histamine got released locally. Now, that locally released histamine is going to interact with the H1 receptors of the cells which are inside of a nose, airways, throat, eyes. So the histamine is going to react with those H1 receptors on those cells. Now, how exactly, what happens exactly when histamine comes in contact with those H1 receptors? So what happens with those cells inside the airways and the eyes and nose? So let's understand that from this slide. So as you can see on the screen, that we see that histamine is over here. So we can see the histamine molecules over here, and the histamine molecules, so we can see the histamine molecules over here. They're outside, just outside the cell. So we can consider this the receptor site over here, somewhere the receptor for histamine, that is the H1 receptor, will be over here. So histamine coming in, attaching to the H1 receptor. So this is the H1 receptor. So once the H1 receptor gets in close contact with histamine, what happens? There is a interest. This is the inside of the cell. This is outside of the cell. So what happens inside of the cell? Now there are multiple chemical pathways and signaling that happens inside the cell. So this is the this is inside the cell. Now what is happening over here? Once the interaction happens, there are multiple signaling pathways that happen inside the cell, which further leads to these kind of changes. We have blood vessel changes happening, we have nerve ending stimulation happening, and we have airway constriction happening. Now what happens in the blood vessel changes? So there are two kinds of scenarios. Either the blood vessel can get widened, we call it vasodilation, or the blood vessels can become leaky. So what happens? That the space between the cells, that increases slightly, which lets fluids to escape out. So what will happen if there is vasodilation, if there is widening of the blood vessels? More blood will come in, more blood will lead to redness and warmth. Okay, so this is one of the symptoms that is going to happen, redness and warmth. That is going to happen because more blood is now flowing, because the blood vessels have been dilated, because histamine has attached itself to the H1 receptor. Now the blood vessels can also become leaky. Fluid is escaping out of these blood vessels. What will happen? There will be swelling, and this will further lead to runny nose. So we can see the symptoms: runny nose, redness and warmth happening. So this is all happening inside of a nasal cavity. Nasal cavity means inside of a nose. And at the second situation that can happen is a nerve ending stimulation. So H1 receptor binding stimulates the nerve cells, and this can further cause us itching. The third thing that can happen is the airway constriction. What is happening? The H1 receptors, histamine binds to H1 receptors, which further causes the smooth muscle contractions. Contraction will cause narrowing of the bronchial tubes, which will further bronchial tubes. These are inside our lungs. This is inside our lungs, so these are part of our lungs. So what will happen? That will cause worsening and breathing difficulties. So we can see that wheezing sound sometimes coming in allergic reactions. People are not able to breathe properly. So why is that? Because the constriction of the smooth muscles, because of the stimulation caused by H1 receptors, that was further caused by histamine. Okay, so next, now moving ahead. So what are the symptoms that we are seeing over here? We are seeing sneezing, we are seeing runny nose, watery eyes and itching. So all of this is caused by which molecule? That is histamine, which is further released by mast cells. Okay, so in this slide we are going to discuss that how antihistamines work. So we know that the allergic reactions are basically caused by histamine. So there are medicines which we call as antihistamines, and how do they work and how do they stop the symptoms, allergic symptoms that we see in the patients. So this is the H1 receptor that we have on our cells, that we have already discussed in the previous slide deck, that there are H1 receptors which are mainly responsible for the allergic reactions in the cells. So now how do antihistamines work on them? So I have created this slide in which we can take the example of histamine as a red car, and the parking space we'll consider it as the receptor which is on the cell. And these cells are, again, I'm going to reiterate it again, these cells are basically located in our nasal cavity, in our airways, and near our eyes, skin. So you know, these are the cells that I'm talking about, like they're already there in our respiratory system. Okay, so now what happens, I'll just give a brief background again on this. What is happening? A person, suppose, went to a garden and there they inhaled some pollen. So the pollen then got attached to the mast cells, which is located in the nasal cavity or somewhere down towards the respiratory tract. So the pollen came in, the pollen attached itself over there to the mast cell, and the mast cell got activated, and in the granules, the secretory granules which were inside the mast cell, the secretory granules were already having histamine stored inside the mast cell, so that got released. So that histamine got released, and once that histamine is released, and that is a locally acting chemical, so that's why histamine was basically called an autocoid. So it's a locally acting chemical. Now that locally acting chemical then is further going and interacting with the other cells which are over there, which are present locally over there, are also having the H1 receptors on them. So they can be inside the naval cavity. I would say naval cavity means the inside our respiratory system, inside our nose. So what is going to happen? The H1 receptors over there, histamine is coming and attaching itself to those H1 receptors. So car over here, this red car is histamine. H1 is the receptor over here, this parking space. So histamine is coming, attaching itself over here, it's parking its car over here, I would say, in this space over here. It gets activated. So this is inside the cell. Now what is happening inside the cell? So inside the cell, the entire signaling pathway gets activated, which further leads to all of the symptoms that I had discussed in the previous slide deck. We have leaky blood vessels, itchiness, and sneezy and runny nose. So this is already discussed in the previous slide deck. And how do antihistamines work? So the antihistamines, so we call them basically antagonists. So what they do is, antihistamines come in, they block the H1 receptors. So still histamine is getting released, but histamine is not getting the chance to come and activate this receptor. So histamine is already released, pollen came in, interacted, histamine got released, but before histamine could come and attach itself to the H1 receptor and cause the symptoms of runny nose and itchiness and sneezing, so the antagonist, that was the antihistamine, that antihistamine came and it attached itself over here, so that now histamine doesn't have that space to attach itself and cause any of those symptoms. So in this way we have antihistamines and they work in this way. So since no histamine is binding, so there is no signal, and because there is no signal which got communicated further inside the cell, so we have healthy cells, we have no itching, and the person is happy. So in this slide, we are going to now discuss the classification of the antihistamines. So we know that antihistamines are basically the drugs or the medicines which prevent histamine from attaching to the H1 receptors, and it prevents us from the allergic symptoms that will happen if histamine could have binded itself to H1 receptors. So antihistamines prevent that. Now there are two types of categories that we have. We have the first generation antihistamines and we have the second generation antihistamines. So the first generation antihistamines, basically they enter the brain, they cause us drowsiness, so we feel sleepy, people feel sleepy. There are a few examples. We have diphenhydramine, promethazine, and chlorpheniramine. So these are the examples. These are the first generation of antihistamines. We have the second generation of antihistamines, which causes us much less drowsiness. So it causes much less drowsiness, and it is prescribed for seasonal allergies, and it is preferred for daytime use. And the examples are citrazine, levocitrazine, we have fixofenadine, we have loratadine. So these are the examples, and these are the types of the classification of antihistamines. Okay, so on this slide, what are we going to discuss? That we have already understood what allergies are and how antihistaminics work. So I'm just going to give a brief overview again of what we had all discussed in all of these slides. So the first part is that there's a trigger. There is always sneezing, and there is sneezing and itchy eyes. So that's the trigger. So how did it happen? Somebody went out, there was pollen exposure, and histamine got released. Okay, so that's part number one. So that's basically, that was discussed in the initial slides. Then we had the immune system overreaction. So what happens? The pollen comes in, the system detects it as a threat, and the mast cells that we have in our body, which is our defense mechanism, so those mast cells basically release histamine. So the mast cells, the third point is mast cells release histamine. So histamine is out there, it's a locally acting chemical, so that's why it's basically called an autocoid. So histamine goes, attaches itself to the nearby H1 receptors inside our nose, throat, eyes, and our respiratory system. So it activates the H1 receptors. Activation of H1 receptors, once H1 receptors gets activated, there is an inside the cell there is a chemical pathway that gets triggered, which further leads to sneezing, itchy eyes, congestion, and runny nose. So these are all the symptoms of allergies that we see. And now how can we treat this? We have antihistamines for our rescue. So antihistamine molecules are there. They block the H1 receptors so that histamine is not able to bind itself to the H1 receptor and cause the reaction and the allergic reactions in the person. So antihistamines come in and they block these receptors before histamine can do that. So what is the conclusion? So a tiny molecule that can cause a problem, so we have histamine for that, and there is another tiny molecule which helps us solve it. So these are the antihistamines. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy learning how medicines work inside the human body, don't forget to subscribe. Join us for easy to understand videos on pharmacology, drug mechanism, diseases, and medical science, one concept at a time. See you in the next video. Thank you.